This is Special Education Programs, and this is the webinar we're having for parent centers on the federal policy statements, two very important federal policy statements that were issued within the last few months, one on the inclusion of children with disabilities in early childhood programs, and a second about family engagement in the early years from birth through third grade. We wanted you to be aware of these policy statements because we believe it can be helpful in your work that you do with families, and it can be helpful in what you do in order to help families understand the importance of both of these, not only inclusion of having children with disabilities included in early childhood programs, but also the importance of them being actively engaged in the programs that their children attend and being actively engaged in all aspects of the child's education. So that's what we really want to focus on today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the presenters. Each of the presentations will be done collaboratively between a staff member from the Health and Human Services and staff members from the Department of Education, and to show and to model the way in which we work collaboratively among the two departments in the federal government on these policy statements. So the first part of the webinar, we're going to be talking about the inclusion statement, the second on family engagement. We have you all on listen-only mode. It's the easiest way of guaranteeing a kind of the good level of quality of the sound when this is archived later on the SIPR website at www.parentcenterhub.org. So if you use the question box, we will be monitoring it, and then we can definitely pass on the questions to the presenters. If you have a comment, also use the question box, which will be really helpful. We are very interested to know whether or not those of you who are very familiar with these statements, whether or not you've used them in your work with families, in your work with states and localities. We'd really like to hear from you about that. We would also like to hear from you as you listen to these presentations, if you have any ideas as to what further work can be done to really highlight the work in these policy statements. What kind of materials you think families or others may want around to provide technical assistance around these policy statements, or what kind of further amplification we can do of these policy statements. So I know you guys are not shy and you'll use the question box, but please feel free to use it as much as you like to make any kind of comments you have on the presentation. So let me turn it over to my colleagues at Health and Human Services and also at OSEP to talk about the inclusion statement. So the first, we're going to be hearing from Jamie and Tracie. So Jamie, Tracie, take it away and you can introduce yourselves.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Jamie Sheehan with Health and Human Services. I work in with the Office of Early Childhood Development at ACF, particularly with the Office of Head Start and the Office of Child Care on the TNTA side. And I'm really happy to be a part of this webinar. I first started my teaching career in the early 90s of 3- and 4-year-olds in one of the first inclusive child care centers in the state of Maryland that was designed from the ground up to serve all children. And then working a lot with the parent centers, the parent center in Maryland, so I'm really happy to be a part of this call, and I'll let Tracie introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar on inclusion and inclusion policy statement. I'm Tracie Dickson in the Department of Education, where I serve on the early childhood team, and I've done a lot of work around promoting this inclusion policy statement. Been getting a lot of really good feedback from the policy statement, and so we're looking forward to hearing your questions today. I think that's it. That's all I know about myself. So let's get started. We have, in the Department of Education and Health and Human Services, worked really hard over the last year to sort of push out this policy statement and support states and local programs in implementation. We both both departments view this policy statement and the work that supports it as a shared responsibility, and it's definitely a top priority for both agencies. So we really would like to, again, hear what you have to say today, get your feedback. Please ask lots of questions, and I'm going to turn it over to Jamie now.
Thank you. So the policy statement was released in September of 2015. The intent was to provide a vision and recommendations to increase the number of infants, toddlers, and preschool children with disabilities in early childhood programs. Both departments believe that all children with disabilities should have access to inclusive, high-quality early childhood programs where they're provided the support that meets high expectations for all children.
This is Tracie again. So the policy statement has, of course, a real focus on the importance of early childhood inclusion. And some of the words that I want to point out on this slide, I'm not going to read the slide to you, but I think that some of the words that we need to focus on are meaningful inclusion and what that means to us as professionals, and how that can benefit children with disabilities. So meaningful inclusion, we know, supports the premise that all children should be educated in the natural environment or the least restrictive environment and have access to general education. Accomplishing this task involves some careful attention to meaningful instruction as well as overcoming social barriers. We know that there is a compelling body of research that suggests that children with and without disabilities benefit both socially and academically from inclusive services in many ways. We know that inclusion increases the rates of learning and achievement for children with disabilities. We know that children with disabilities maintain and make friendships when they are supported in an inclusive environment. We know that children with and without disabilities have a higher performance in the areas of social competence. We know that children without disabilities have the same or better achievement when they have the opportunity to be in the setting with children with disabilities. So there is, a strong research base that supports inclusion, which is part of the reason why the departments are really putting some serious focus on this last year and this year and in the coming years. You can go to the next slide, Carmen. So we know that it's been 30 years now, 30, 40 years, and we're still talking about inclusion and how we can best implement those in our early childhood settings. Children with disabilities continue to face significant barriers in accessing inclusive early childhood programs. There was a survey done recently within the last year or so that pointed out some of the most significant barriers to inclusion. One of the greatest barriers to inclusion is attitudes and beliefs of the professionals who support children with disabilities and families. Some other barriers are fiscal barriers, transportation barriers, personnel qualifications. We know that professional development is one of the key indicators of high-quality early childhood programs, and lack of program quality. So those are some of the barriers that children face. Many, many preschool children with disabilities continue to receive special education services in settings separate from their peers without disabilities, and states have continued to work to expand access to high-quality early learning programs, but of course that expansion hasn't met the needs of the early learning community and children with disabilities.
So some of the obvious facts that we all know is inclusion benefits all children, and children can be effectively educated in inclusive programs using specialized instruction or highly individualized instruction. Families of all children generally have positive views of inclusion. One myth out there is that inclusion is more expensive, and that the fact is that it actually is not. And one of the reasons that some people use to not have inclusive settings is that children aren't ready for inclusion, where we know that that is not a fact and that children don't need to be ready for inclusion. Next.
So 27 years later, inclusion has only increased by 5.7% according to the Department of Education. And as I said earlier, many children continue to be educated in separate settings apart from their peers without disabilities, although research indicates that even with the amount of research that has come out over the years and the laws that support preschool inclusion and early childhood inclusion, the practice of inclusion has increased only a small amount in the last 27 years. So we still have a lot of work to do to ensure that all children have access to high quality, inclusive early childhood settings.
So both HHS and the Department of Education believe that a high-quality early childhood program is inclusive of children with disabilities and their families to ensure that policies and funds and practices enable their full participation to be successful. In Head Start, we have a 10% mandate of programs meaning to enroll children with disabilities who have an IEP or an IFSP, and that's not including those children who will be diagnosed within a school year or identified within a school year.
So the policy statement has some really high expectations, or it sets an expectation for high quality inclusion in early childhood programs. It also highlights the legal and research base for inclusion, specifically the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. There's some information on ADA and other laws that support inclusion. And of course, we all know that there's a very rich research base that supports the benefits of inclusion for all children. The policy statement also provides recommendations to states and local programs and providers for increasing inclusive early learning opportunities for all children. And within the policy statement, you will also find links to lots and lots of free resources that we'll talk about a little bit later in this session that states, local programs, providers, and families can access to ensure that the children we serve have the opportunity to access inclusive learning environments. So we also, in the policy statement, want to ensure that including children with disabilities in general early childhood programs together with their peers without disabilities, of course that's the focus of inclusion. We've been working with DEC and AYC together with their position statement to further these goals, including holding expectations for intentionally promoting participation in learning and social activities, and using evidence-based or using research-based services and supports to foster young children's development so that they can develop friendships with their peers, have a sense of belonging, and have the opportunity to learn and grow along with their peers without disabilities. Of course, this applies to all young children with disabilities from those with the mildest disabilities to those with the most significant disabilities. So we want to ensure children with a range of disabilities have the opportunity to participate in inclusive settings first. So we're going to talk a little bit about the recommendations that you can find in the policy statement, the state recommendations and the local recommendations. And although these recommendations are designed for states in mind and local programs in mind, there are some things that you can do that fit within these recommendations. So if you want to go to the next slide, Carmen. So we'll start with the recommendations for state action, and again, you'll find these at the end of the policy statement on inclusion. The first recommendation is for states is to create a state-level interagency task force and plan for inclusion. I think here the parent centers can support professionals and families to participate in interagency task forces that plan for inclusion, participating on the ICC, participating on the State Advisory Council. All these task forces really should have some focus on inclusion, and if they don't, it's an opportunity for providers, the parent centers, all providers who support children with disabilities to participate to advance the agenda of inclusion. Ensuring that state policies are consistent with high-quality inclusion. Those policies are often discussed and addressed on task forces and advisory committees. We urge you to participate in those meetings in your states. Tracking data on the goals on inclusion. Resource allocation actually is one that prevent programs from fully implementing inclusive settings, lack of resources, and then ensuring the quality rating frameworks are inclusive, and Jamie is going to talk about that.
So some examples around ensuring high-quality inclusion given states' QRIS systems and ensuring the quality rating frameworks are inclusive is to look for frameworks that include indicators for children with disabilities as opposed to sort of an add-on or having it be optional. And if within your state, parents and advocates can work with other groups that are developing frameworks or could think about revising a framework that is more inclusive and applicable for children with disabilities rather than sort of an add-on or applying it only at the highest level versus having it be inclusive. Another example for looking at some recommendations requiring state actions would be to look across some of the observation tools that are being used in states' QRIS as far as class or ITERs or ECHRs, and knowing that those tools don't necessarily or adequately address inclusive practices. So a program could look like it's high quality even though they're not demonstrating inclusive practices. They might just be showing high ratings through the class or ITERs or ECHRs. So it may be a part of consumer education and letting families know that it could be a part of their decision making, but that parents would need to know that unless they're going to make some observations and look for their own quality as it relates to the observations, they would want to do that. One thing we've seen with our Head Start grantees who are monitored through our monitoring system on class is that we've seen a higher number of Head Start grantees that have a higher number of IEPs, have higher class scores across all three domains. We don't necessarily know the correlating factors of that, but we are happy to see, and we sort of use that in our data to talk to grantees about meeting or exceeding their 10% mandate is letting them know that we've seen the data across the last 5 years and seeing that the higher number of IEPs that a grantee has is the higher their class scores will be across all 3 domains. Next.
So this slide are the final 4 recommendations for state actions. I'm not going to read all of them to you, but I want to focus on the last one, raising public awareness. I think that the parent centers are in a unique position to continue to help us to advance the agenda of inclusion by raising the awareness of the importance of it and helping states to understand the barriers to inclusion and the some ways that we can support them in overcoming those barriers. But I want to say that I think the most important way that we can raise awareness is by educating families on what inclusion is and what a high quality early childhood program looks like when they have some really good inclusion going on there. And teaching families about how to access those inclusive programs, what to look for, and helping them to understand that their child, although it has a disability, has the right to access any early childhood program that a child without disabilities has access to. So we encourage you to continue to do the work that you do. We know that there is focus on inclusion, but given that we're still talking about this all these years later, clearly we still have a lot more work to do in educating the public and families on the importance of inclusion. The next slide. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, here we go. Okay, so there are several recommendations that can also be implemented at the local level. Interesting, the very first one is partnering with families. Again, we can't stress that enough. Inclusion doesn't work without family engagement and family support. So we know that that's the focus of the parent centers. That together with raising the awareness of inclusion, I think will go a long way. We know that the parent centers do a lot around educating families around their rights and the legal basis for inclusion. And accessing and improving the quality of inclusion only increases with increased awareness and education about the benefits of inclusion. And the last one is reviewing and modifying resource allocations. Again, lack of resources is one of the primary barriers to inclusion. Next slide. And these are the last 4 recommendations that you can find in the inclusion policy statement that focus on the local level. Enhancing professional development. There has been a significant amount of research that supports the notion that high-quality inclusive programs is directly related to the quality of the professionals that serve young children in those settings, including having appropriate staff-child ratios, staff collaboration, ensuring access to specialized supports, and formal collaborations with community partners. And I think that's where the parent centers come in, is helping to establish those relationships between the LEA, early childhood providers, with families and building that bridge. Jamie?
So one way to think about sort of the enhancement of professional development and at HHS and between the Office of Child Care and the Office of Head Start and the CCBG Notice of Proposed Rule that's out talking about quality dollars and using sort of those dollars to enhance professional development in inclusive practices. So thinking about The local recommendation for number 5, enhancing professional development and ways that we can support parents, is asking parents to ask of directors about professional development opportunities that are offered to teachers related to inclusion and to inclusive practices. We can encourage parents to look for programs that offer high quality staff, asking about their knowledge or competencies, and really diving into positive attitudes and beliefs about inclusion or disability in order to foster development in all children. And I mentioned in the beginning about working at an inclusive child care center. I had really no experience, but I certainly had a positive attitude and a belief, and was able to take some advice from my director and get some professional development for myself. But it was really the attitude and the belief of inclusion that really sort of helped me understand and helped me be the best teacher that I could have been. For recommendation number 8, develop formal collaborations with community partners. We know that there are short policy and research briefs that are out, and parents have been using them with success. And the videos from the Connect module, when parents are being told that they can't implement something, or when parents sees a gap in practice, they've used these resources in multiple ways. For example, short policy briefs being used with a particular practice focus within the module that has both the regulatory and legislative support for the practice, so it makes it really hard for a program to deny a service. So really having advocating for the parents and giving them the sort of the background for these pieces. The research briefs have also had a similar purpose, and parents have used them with the short video and the practice demonstrations to show directors and teachers the kind of practices they want to see with their child, which also means, you know, partnering with local allies like from early intervention and ESSE and disability services. Lots of times seeing the practice, and they think, you know, when we explain over, you know, just verbally, but then actually when they see it, like, oh yeah, I can do that, or oh, I can see it being implemented by someone else, and so it makes it seem a little bit more doable. Next.
So before I talk about resources, I want to again encourage all of the listeners on the call today, the webinar, to take a look at if you have not read the inclusion policy statement, to take some time to read it. It really has, you know, some of the latest research, most cutting edge research woven throughout the paper. The recommendations at the local and state level can definitely be, the implementation of those can definitely be supported by the parent centers. And there are also a ton of free resources that are available that are linked to the inclusion policy statement. You'll see some here on this slide. I'm going to talk about a few of them in the upcoming slides, but we want you to, you'll see the link to the ed.gov early learning website. Please take some time to visit that website. There are far more resources on that website than I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. Carmen, next slide. So one of the premier resources that we refer to quite often are the Division for Early Childhood Recommended Practices. Those practices are sort of guidelines that help providers to provide the best high-quality services to young children with disabilities. This is a picture or a screenshot of the website, and you'll see the website address listed at the top. The DEC recommended practices can be downloaded for free, and I urge you to take a look at those. Next slide, Carmen. The Connect modules were funded by the Office of Special Education Program a number of years ago. They are still available. There are 8 courses that you could take. They're very well-done modules. They're not very long in terms of the time that it takes to move through them. There is one on families. I think it's the 4th module, Better Together, Powerful Family Partnerships. I especially like that one. That's one of my favorite modules. But they are free and they're practice focused and can also be used in instructional ways and also with helping families to better understand inclusive practices. Next slide. This is a screenshot of OSEP's Early Learning webpage. What you see on this slide are links to several webinars that we've held over the last year about inclusion. Those webinars are archived on our website. I urge you to take a look at them. They're about an hour long, very well done, and full of information. You also see on this page there's a link to the inclusion policy statement. Next slide. And then the ECTA Center is a technical assistance center that is funded by the Office of Special Education Programs. They have tons and tons and tons of resources on inclusion at this website. Please feel free to visit this website. Again, it's all free. They have a whole page, this page, and there are other pages that are dedicated specifically for inclusion. There's lots of information for families on the ECTA Center website, so please take a look at that. And then the next slide is the NAEYC and the DEC Joint Policy Statement on Inclusion. That sort of is a companion piece to the HHS Ed policy statement. So we encourage you to go to that link that you see at the top of the screen and take some time to read that policy, that position statement as well. What you don't see here is the early childhood team at Ed will be pulling together more resources over the next year that are going to be designed to support families and providers. We're also going to be releasing exemplars of inclusive practices and what that looks like in the classroom. So you'll be seeing those within the next year. We have a very strong communication strategy plan for advancing early child inclusion and providing additional resources to support the policy paper. Jamie?
So we have resources on the ECLKC, which is the Early Childhood Learning Knowledge Center. So if you were just to Google search ECLKC, you would be taken to our website. And on our website, we have some training and technical assistance resources. We have what's referred to as these 15-minute in-service suites that come to support professional development through a variety of training topics and materials. They are, fully packaged professional development that includes PowerPoints and trainer's notes and tips for teachers. There's some supplements for parents. And what we have for highly individualized teaching and learning are in 3 areas. So curriculum modification, embedded learning, and intensive individualizing teaching practices. We believe that young children vary widely in their skills, knowledge, backgrounds, and abilities, and that teaching children requires individualized teaching and learning opportunities to be able to thrive in a preschool setting, as well as infant and toddler classrooms and settings. Our curriculum modifications consist of a variety of purposeful strategies for making changes to typical classroom activities and routines and interactions in order to enhance any child's participation. Our embedded learning modules refer to teaching and learning that takes place during the day in the daily classroom activities where teachers can plan systematic instructional interactions during daily activities and routines to enhance a child's learning in a specific skill or concept. And then our intensive individualized teaching practice refer to a variety of directed, explicit instructional practices that are used by teachers frequently and systematically to help a child achieve a particular learning objective. And the child's learning activity may or may not look different from the other learning activities that are happening in the classroom for other children. On our website, we also have a lot of other resources that connect to a variety of free resources. So we have Head Start Disability newsletters, which include a family section and which go out to Head Start disability coordinators. And so we connect to the Connect modules, we connect to DEC recommended practices. So we connect to a lot of different resources which give disability coordinators and other practitioners a variety of ways to see what materials are out there. We also have resources for the Head Start Center for Inclusion, and so even though that was funded a while ago, that website is still up and we connect to it. What this is a screenshot of are the classroom visuals and support, and I just would like to share that this is one of our top shared and liked and used through our social media data. This is one of our top pages. So we know that there's great interest in materials for resources that support inclusive practices so that teachers can help children within their classroom. Families have identified resources to pass on to teachers. Teachers have identified resources to pass on to families. And again, this is something that can be implemented in different environments. Social stories are also a big, so this is the screenshot of the visuals, the classroom visuals, but the social stories are also a big resource as well. Next.
Was on mute. I want to say that the policy statement was released again in September 2015 with the intent of providing a vision and recommendations to increase the number of infants, toddlers, and preschool children with disabilities in inclusive settings. And both departments believe that all children with disabilities should have access to inclusive, high-quality early childhood programs where they are provided with appropriate support in meeting the high expectations. We want to thank you for listening to this presentation today. We want to continue to build a partnership with the parent centers to promote this culture of inclusion. If you have further questions, please feel free to email myself or Jamie. Our email addresses are on the next slide. Right there. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to send either of us an email.
Yes, thank you everyone.
Thank you, Tracie. Thank you, Jamie. I have posted in the chat box some of the questions that were answered earlier. Given the number of questions that have come in, we might do a Q&A document after this webinar that we'll post along with the webinar. Jamie and Tracie may also look through all the questions that have come in so far and answer them directly. Some of you asked questions about data or other kinds of research, and that actually can be found in the policy statement itself. So there's quite a few citations in the policy statement that might be helpful for you also. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Vicki Myers and Kiersten Beigel from HHS to talk about the policy statement on family engagement. So Kiersten and Vicki, take it away.
So Kiersten, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself first?
Good afternoon. Great to be with you all. My name's Kiersten Beigel, and I work in the same office Jamie does, really, at the Administration for Children and Families, focusing on early childhood and Head Start in particular. So I think I'll stop there in the interest of time.
Hi, so this is Vicki Myers, and I work in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. Before I came to OESE a couple of years ago, I spent almost 5 years in OSEP, so I think I have met several of you probably. If you can go to the next slide, Carmen, we can dive right in. So we wanted to give you all a little background on the purpose for us writing this statement. And one of the big things that came up for us was the fact that each of us had a framework on family engagement, and people were starting to ask, well, which one should we be using? So we thought it would be a pretty wise idea to look at both of these frameworks and find the common threads, and to help people to understand how these go together, and to try to create some continuity for them, and also some recommendations around these two policies. So next slide. So we wanted to work on building a common language around family and community engagement, and family engagement in particular. And we wanted folks to think about prioritizing family engagement as an early childhood and educational strategy. So, you know, we know oftentimes that in the early childhood programs, and especially in early Head Start and Head Start, that family engagement is a priority, but that oftentimes once kids get to kindergarten, that it is not so much a priority and is actually sometimes discouraged. And so we felt like this policy statement could help guide K-12 or K-3 folks toward understanding that family engagement is really important. And then we also wanted to provide some guidance to the field for implementing high-impact family engagement strategies. So Kiersten will explain to you in the next slide how we came up with the definition that we did.
Well, you know, this policy statement is pretty similar in its sort of structure to the inclusion statement, in that we look to do some defining and to highlight some research, as well as to really draw on the principles that we know make for effective family engagement practice, and then look at state and local kinds of strategies. So you'll see the same kinds of flavor in this policy statement as in the inclusion. It is a long document, which we hope in future to chunk out for more user-friendly purposes. But as far as the definition of family engagement goes, you know, we could kind of go around and around on this, because definitions for family engagement tend to be crafted, I think, around funding requirements or program requirements. You may have in your centers a particular way that you define family engagement based on the mission of your center work or your training work, or the legislation that guides some of your work with parents and families. We have found that the ways that we can engage families within the child care program, the Head Start program, the pre-K program, can all have kind of technical tie-ins to what people are funded to do. So what we were really looking to do with this definition is not to get bogged down in the, you know, the conversation here, but to really just stress that when we're talking about family engagement, we're talking about the institutions and the organizations and the centers and the programs that actually are responsible for children's learning and development over time, and that that can embed in their practices sound policies, procedures, and sort of strategies for how they work with families. So the onus for this policy statement is really on those who are out there working on behalf of and with children and families. And that's, you know, that's a very sort of system-y focused definition. I think, you know, when we really talk about practice in the community, we're really talking about, you know, genuine relationships that we establish with families that are really focused on overall support for family well-being and children's health and development. and that we're really focused on a common purpose in supporting children's learning, but the only way to effectively do that is to really ground our work in being responsive to families' interests and passions and desires for their children's learning and development. So, obviously that's a huge other side to this, which I think we'll touch on a little bit more. Moving along, I'm going to just touch briefly on some research highlights. These are things that are pretty obvious to us and in the field for folks who are steeped in the work, but we need to highlight these things because we need to make the case where the case has not yet adequately been made that obviously parents are critical and essential partners in the work around educating children. So some of the research we draw on, and we really are drawing on only some of it here in the presentation, has to do with the importance of the parent-child relationship as sacred and critical to children's cognitive development in their early foundation, and that when parenting is sensitive and responsive and culturally grounded, obviously as parenting is and nested in a community and a culture, that children can get the building blocks they need to develop and to learn over time. And we know that in our earlier years that these are actually critical practices we can support that set a foundation for later types of family engagement in K-12. The third bullet really relates to this idea about how important social networks are for parents. And obviously the parent centers are experts on how we see parents connecting with others who've had the same experiences and learning from each other on how to effectively be, advocates for their children and their communities and that kind of thing. But we also know that while parents learn from each other, we also know for highly stressed parents, these networks are critical parts of their ability to support and bond with their children as well as to support their learning over time. Moving along, a couple of other things we wanted to highlight were the importance of relationships in terms of building those strong relationships between the provider, the school, the center, what have you, and families to reinforce the learning that goes on at home and in the community. And that we know that two-way communication is essential because we often talk about family engagement as being a shared responsibility. People bring different parts to that, whether it's the family or the teacher and professional, but that two-way communication is an essential component to effective family engagement. And obviously that does not happen in a vacuum. It is 100% grounded in people's culture, their ability to communicate effectively through language and having language access. These are all factors for relationship building. And then another set of highlights that relate to the homeschool connection is really just that idea that we know from the research that children do better when the things they learn at home are reinforced in school and the things they learn in school are reinforced at home, and that for the learner, that is essential. And there are a lot of researchers now who are trying to expand that idea to thinking about those connections in any time, anywhere children learn. So in after-school communities, obviously libraries have been effective partners in this way, and museums for thinking about those learning connections for children. I was on the next slide, Carmen. And that family activities such as reading and talking to young children lead to positive outcomes. There's just, skyscrapers of research on the topic related to literacy, and it's important around family involvement. And then the last slide that has to do with some research highlights has to do with the importance of family well-being. And a lot of our federal programs do fund low-income families. So when we think about some of the adversities and the overwhelming challenges that some of our low-income families are facing in their communities, that we do know family well-being is a strong predictor of children's school readiness. We do know there's an achievement gap associated with poverty and other stressors, associated stressors. And so we do know that by supporting families' resilience and their strengths and connecting them to the supports they need, that this really is kind of a way to boost opportunities for children's learning and development, to boost family engagement, and that some before they become involved in different kinds of activities that are specifically targeting them by school communities in early childhood program communities. We do have, I've just highlighted here at the bottom of some of these slides, we have some research to practice briefs on this ECLKC that Jamie was mentioning, the Early Childhood Learning and Knowledge Center. There's a link on the slide, and these kind of go through different outcomes and try to highlight the research for folks who want to know, what is the research about family engagement? Why does it matter? Why should my school district be caring about it? How does it advance children's academics and that kind of thing? So for people who are looking to really want to understand, the research behind why we should be doing what we all think is kind of obvious and important, these are good briefs to consider.
So this is Vicki. So in thinking about the two frameworks, we came up with these 5 principles that we felt like were the high points of both of those frameworks. And so we feel like the first step really in systemically embedding effective family engagement in early childhood systems and programs, and so when we say that, we mean from birth through grade 3, is to establish a culture in which families are seen as essential partners in the systems and programs that serve their children. And one quick story about the use of the word essential was that when we put the draft of this statement out for public comment, even though we created this statement for systems, there were families that looked at it, and we had used the phrase equal partners, that schools and families should be equal partners. And we got some pushback on that schools are not equal to parents and shouldn't be equal to parents. And that really kind of struck us, and it was an aha moment. And it helped us to really think about that families are essential partners in order to get the outcomes that we're trying to get from our programs. So the departments consider the following principles that you see there as foundational to establishing a culture that values families as essential to getting those outcomes. So just looking at the idea of creating continuity and consistency with children and families, as I said before, oftentimes there's a lot more family engagement going on in the early childhood systems, and that once kids get to kindergarten, that's not necessarily the case. And even if it is the case that families are welcome, we just wanted to think about creating some language that will help provide some continuity and consistency in the use of vocabulary and in practices that are highly effective, and just the way people talk about valuing family engagement. We also want schools and programs to value respectful and trusting relationships between families and professionals. So providing, say maybe, opportunities for family engagement that are not very welcoming or that are not very convenient for families, or that are just kind of one-offs, to us is not building the kinds of relationships that we feel are going to provide the outcomes that we want to see happening for children. The other thing, and I think this is something that we really thought a lot about in for the K-12, is that we want those relationships to really be linked to children's learning and development. So I think oftentimes Kiersten is from the early learning world, and I'm more from the K-12 world. So I'm speaking from a K-12 lens. But things like spaghetti dinners and muffins for moms or donuts for dads, those are nice events, but we really want to push the idea of using effective practices that are linked directly to children's learning outcomes and developmental outcomes. Also, we wanted to make sure that we didn't leave out children's health and their mental health and social and emotional well-being, that those things are also important. And I think, again, from a K-12 lens, that sometimes I think school personnel sort of shy away from those pieces, and we know that those are critical pieces that we need to be watching out for. Obviously, in our changing demographics, we need to make sure that, you know, school and program personnel have the capacity and understanding to be very culturally and linguistically responsive to our families. So that is one that we want to make sure that we're providing some technical support for program and school personnel. And then with that, we also want to just overall, you know, besides the cultural and linguistic piece, is to provide some good professional development and support for our systems to know how to work with families. I know that in some teacher surveys that have taken place over the years that teachers say that they feel least prepared in working with families, and so that's something we feel should be a priority. And then as Kiersten said, we really want to support families' connections and capabilities. Oftentimes families who have, well, any child, but, you know, that the networking, you know, to just get to know folks that have the same sorts of issues that your child might have. I know a couple of my grandsons have IEPs, and it's, you know, really good for their moms to get together and to talk about, you know, how does this look for your child? How does this look for yours? And so just to be able to look at the supports that they can create for each other. So the idea of also just systemically embedding family engagement strategies. And so, you know, across an entire school district or across an entire, you know, state plan from birth through 3rd grade, how do they systemically put this together? So I'm going to leave, you know, the last couple because they're pretty obvious, and go on to, oh, I guess this, yeah, there they are right there. I was looking at my paper instead of at your thing. But yeah, those last two, you know, are obvious, pretty obvious. So going on to our recommendations. So again, we were making these recommendations for systems, for early childhood systems and for, you know, school district systems. So we want them to plan and prioritize for family engagement. We want them to create consistent messages about how they value family engagement. We obviously need them to invest and allocate resources, and to establish some policies and procedures and practices that support family engagement. And that kind of makes me think of like providing technical assistance and professional development for personnel. And then there it is, you know, that's what I was thinking of, was to build that workforce capacity. And then just having some data that's going to enable them to think about, you know, are these practices that we're putting in place making any sort of difference for our kids? So we're basically running out of time here. Carmen, do you want to talk about, you know, how this impacts the early intervention and special ed pieces?
Yes. We also wanted to stress that there's 2 different versions when you go online to find the policy statement. There's a shorter executive summary, which is only 4 pages, and then the longer policy statement itself is about 16 or 17 pages. We really strongly urge you to look through the 16, 17-page policy statement because it goes into a lot more detail on all of these. And what you'll see throughout the policy statement is an emphasis on equity, on the emphasis on children from very diverse backgrounds, and very often you'll also see references to children who have disabilities or even families who may have parents or other adults who also experience disability, and the need to be inclusive and welcoming to them also. So we strongly encourage you to read the entire policy statement. So none of what appears in the policy statement should be a surprise to you all as parent centers. You've known this for a very long time because you know that having a child with a disability itself is an additional challenge. It can be an additional stress, and that families of children with disabilities have additional support needs, not the least of which is trying to understand their children's and their own legal rights under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. But they also have additional support needs, and the policy statement addresses that and makes people think about populations such as children with disabilities when coming up with family support plans. The other thing is that IDEA has had for a very long time, as you know, because you're funded through IDEA, a kind of a real emphasis on family engagement and family knowledge and power. So we're very cognizant of that, and we know that you all could be a very good source of information and practices that will help that. And lastly, the policy statement really emphasizes the role of parents as leaders, the role that parents have as to lead change, to be involved in making systematic changes, not just changes for their children, if that's what they're interested in and if their capacity is developed to do that. And we know that there's been a lot of work going on in among the parent centers around this, both serving on groups and IDEA partnership, I believe, also are included in the appendices as a way of acknowledging the kind of work that has gone on for many years around developing parent leadership. But that doesn't mean we're not open to and would love to hear from you if you have other ideas, other things that we can do. It's probably clear to you because this policy statement has not been out as long as the inclusions policy statement. We're in the formative stages of deciding how we might want to pursue further work on this, so we would really welcome your comments. And with that, I turn it back over to Vicki or Kiersten.
Kiersten.
Yeah.
Oh, well, do we have time to hear in chat some ideas from folks?
We do. We're already at a little bit past 4. If people would like to leave, that's fine. But if any of you have anything you'd like to write in the chat space in terms of how you're using the family engagement policy, that would be great. And
yeah, we would love to hear from you if you have advice for how we can promote it, who we can promote it to, or any thoughts you had or reactions that you want to share with us as we're like fledgling. We're little fledglings here in terms of sharing this document, like Carmen said, trying to promote it.
Oh, here's a comment, a question. I'll put it in the chat space too. Okay. There you go. This came from Diana, and I'll send it out right now to everybody. Oh, I sent it only to didn't send it out to everybody. Okay. So Diana's comment is the one idea is to use the IDEA partnership dialogue guides process to bring together families, schools, and others to discuss the policy statement and how to make it a reality in their local community. That's a good suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
If there's any others. Oh, there's a lot. There's a lot of questions coming in.
Can you make a list?
People are chatting.
Yay!
I wish you could see it, but.
Okay, I'm going to put them all into for the entire audience. Here you go. Here's one: university programs.
Yeah.
Okay, so university.
That's great.
For teacher training.
We're actually working on. This is Kiersten, and I work with a national center on parent, family, and community engagement that we fund out of Administration for Children and Families, and that's actually something we're working on right now is teacher competencies to embed in professional development systems. Nice. To help teachers with family engagement. So glad to see that you were thinking that way and that we're working on it. And you said, of course. Good idea. Surprise suggestion.
Okay. So somebody's already shared it to their newsletter, which is great. And there's the link also to the IDEA dialogue guides, I believe. Oh, this one's a really interesting idea from Montana. I'm going to put it out there for everybody to see. Oh, wait a minute. I didn't get that. Sorry. Well, let me read it out loud. We've been using it to educate our legislators and governor's office.
Wow.
That's a terrific suggestion.
Yeah, they're good to share with your state advisory, early childhood advisory councils, and if you have any early learning councils locally. Yeah, your different governing bodies in your states and communities who would have a vested interest.
Okay. So the other one before that had to do with we should connect with the IHEs that have teacher training programs and have discussions on how to embed family engagement activities in their curricula. Right. And another one is in reviewing state plans for ESSA implementation, ensure that this policy is truly addressed in ways that families are engaged in decisions about the plan. Great. Okay. And another one, right now. As part of the New Jersey Early Childhood Race to the Top application, I put together a chart of all the professional development requirements in New Jersey and nationally, for example, Head Start, about working effectively with families.
Nice.
Okay. Oh, here we go. This is the last comment. Sorry. Trying to get this into the chat so everybody can read it at the same time. Hold on. Okay. So this is, we have a family partnership strand in our SPDIG, and Kiersten, SPDIG is the state personal development grants funded under OSEP grant that the PTI is heading. I can't wait to use this in more detail in that venue. Please make sure that the message from the top down is that they need to include us in these discussions as they have them. Support and urging from the top, even stating the need to include us, would be very helpful if ensuring that we're at the table to help with this work and connect families to it. I think you'll see in the policy statement there is an incredible emphasis on having families at the table from the beginning and in all aspects of planning, not just as a recipient. So I think that comes across in the statement. And this last one, I think maybe more in your shop, Kiersten, make the requirements for family engagement stronger in the child care block grant development application.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, I think that the Office of Child Care Director is pretty excited that there were some new requirements in the CCDBG Act that actually reference parent engagement for the first time. So one of the things we're trying to do is build off of some of those requirements and build them out into some TA that is kind of robust and help, you know, state systems think about how they can embed family engagement from a child care perspective. It's kind of complicated trying to sort out how we can be most effective, but we have a 5-year grant, and we're looking at, you know, the best QRIS indicators, those family engagement teacher competencies. We're looking at trying to build a framework that speaks to the child care world about family engagement and trying to, you know, think of ways to connect, you know, this idea of consumer engagement, which seems to be like the big focus in terms of ensuring families understand quality child care, with this larger realm of like parents as, you know, decision makers and as teachers and nurturers of the children. So we have some reframing that we're looking forward to doing, and there's a lot in the works, but I appreciate that there's work to do there.
So the next question is with the new administration coming in, how can we make sure that this policy statement continues and is scaled up?
It's such a good question. I mean, I think like some of those things are sort of out of our control, and some of those things are in our control depending on where we work, right? So the fact that we're investing in TA to implement these laws, some of these laws that relate to family engagement in HHS, I think means that we can actually, right now we're in the formative stages of coming together as bringing our TA providers together across Ed and HHS to think about how we can support implementation of this statement. So, I think we're all in the middle of having contracts and grants that are working on this kind of thing, which will, cross into different administrations, at least for the next several years, I'm thinking. So that's one way, just kind of those of us doing TA work. I don't know if you have other thoughts, Vicki or Carmen, on that.
No.
It's a $1 million question.
We have hopes and dreams.
Yeah. We're about 15 minutes over. There's just 2 other comments. One is mostly a comment about how, as the parent centers, they've noticed that when they help families be involved in their child's school, that and the administration was open to it, that they saw real improvement in not only special education but also regular education in the school, which is, part of what part of the reason why this statement was put together. And then there's a question here about Title V block grant, well, a comment that to be specific in the child and youth with special health care needs Title V block grants, that be specific that those families and professional family leadership should include independent community-based organizations ruled by families rather than just paid staff of the system itself. So something else to consider. But to be respectful of people's time, and because we are about 15 minutes almost over, I think we're going to finish the webinar. We will get a transcript of the chat and all the things that went into it. So we will look both Ed staff and HHS staff and see if we need maybe a follow-up document to answer some of your questions. But thank you so much for your participation, and we really look forward for continued communication with you all as you work through these 2 policy statements and make them come to life in the lives of families and children. I want to thank again my colleagues at HHS and my colleagues here at the Department of Ed for being on this webinar and helping us with it. So bye, everybody. Thank you.